Gracious memory of the manger, sent from somewhere to my soul.
Pretty woman.
Probably the most important reason to wear the head covering is the Bible commands it.
Today we want to talk about head covering. Somebody say head covering.
The head covering, the third battle that I think Satan is waging.
No matter how we dressed as Mennonite boys, nothing caught the attention of the community and people outside of the Mennonite culture like the covering. It was not uncommon to go into town to shop or to do other things and have strangers come up and ask my sister or my mother why they were wearing that head thing.
Julia Roberts and Betty Boop make a fictional debut as Mennonite women. Betty is a 1930s animation icon. Early in her life, Betty was censored by the Motion Picture Production Code. Her risque personality was dropped for a more innocent and wholesome character. 1990 was the year Julia Roberts starred in the film Pretty Woman. That same year, a letter was sent out to the Greenwood conservative Mennonite congregation concerning membership. It was a break from tradition in its brevity. It was also softer than earlier mandates. Corinthians 11:2-16 teaches Christian women to cover their head when in prayer.
I have a sermon on the war on morality, the headship order, and the head covering.
It says the Christian woman's devotional covering. But in that, when they start saying, should this only be when they're doing devotions or praying? And it says, no, it should be all the time. Okay, so they basically, even though what I'm going to show you here is that 1 Corinthians 11 is not teaching that women need to cover their heads with some kind of garment. It's not teaching that. And there's other churches that teach this that aren't Mennonite.
Your covering, when you wear it, is a symbol and a testimony of the gospel message.
This was without question for the whole history of the church. All right, only now is it controversial within the last generation or so. So from Paul's time to the earliest church meetings until very, very recently, the passage that I've called controversial, because it is in our day, wasn't so at all. For every culture and every ethnicity, women and wives covered their heads, at least in worship, because God said so. And hence my nerves this morning to try to take a passage honestly that most people literally can't stand.
Amish and Mennonite believe the Bible's decree that the glory of her hair is her husband's, so tucking it under a bonnet becomes the modest thing to do. But the size and color of hats and bonnets were an important distinction from the English and between other Anabaptist groups. It went from a large bonnet with strings to a small, black, bobby-pinned, doily, that blended with the hair. The Bible is clear that God is concerned about the outward appearance.
And I've read many commentaries, and most of them say, guess what? Yes, it is a head covering. Some of them will say it's culture and use all kinds of reasons why we don't need to wear it. R.C. Sproul, who said this, if anything transcends local custom, it is those that are rooted and ordained at creation. That is why I'm very frightened to loosen of this passage. He's talking about 1 Corinthians 11. John Piper, John MacArthur, Yohanan. Why do they not wear it in their churches? Because it's too hard. They can't change it now. The culture has made it too hard for them to change. Watchman Nee, a well-known Baptist Chinese pastor, said this about the headship and the headship covering. The matter of head covering belongs to God's government. For those who do not know God's government, it's impossible to exhort them to have their heads covered.
All fashion's worldly. Well, you know that dress with the bonnet used to be in fashion.
My we 70 this year. I called my mom. I said, Mom, tell me about grandma and great-grandma. My mom said, oh yeah. You didn't go to church without something on your head if you was a woman. Grandma said, we would get a whipping for trying to go to church without something on our head. Or we put something on our head. Grandmama taught us that, and Mama taught us that. And I said, Mom, when did you start to see that fade? She said, somewhere as I was coming up in about 25, maybe 30 years ago, I started to see it fade. In the 2nd century, Hippolytus of Rome wrote the apostolic tradition. I quoted that recently when we ordained deacons, if you recall. It includes the statement, let all the women have their heads covered. Furthermore, the catacombs, the system of burial caverns under Rome, where early Christians hid during times of persecution, are full of pictures of women praying with coverings and men without. Not only was it an apostolic teaching, but various early church fathers such as Augustine of Hippo, St. John Chrysostom, Tertullian, John Calvin and Matthew Henry, Protestant reformer Martin Luther, John Wesley.
C. The symbolic wedding band if worn is acceptable as a plain, simple, single band without any jeweled setting. Note, congregational policy is not to perform any wedding ceremony where rings are exchanged. Persons will be asked to refrain from exchanging rings during the ceremony. During the Middle Ages, the wedding ring symbolized the couple was married in a Christian ceremony. But the ring dates back to the ancient Egyptians who used woven reeds. One might say it took this group 4,790 years to culturally accept a wedding ring. The timid allowance in the Greenwood Mennonite Church was a liberal accommodation to the wishes of younger members.
A woman who prays without her head covered. What does he mean by it? So we know that very well that the minute we understand, we are obliged to act accordingly. Take any words in the New Testament and forget everything except pledging yourself to act accordingly. You'd say. If we do that, my whole life would be ruined. How would I ever get on in this world? And he says sarcastically, herein lies the real place of Christian scholarship. Christian scholarship is the church's prodigious invention to defend itself against the Bible, to ensure that we can continue to be good Christians without the Bible coming too close.
If for no other reason, we should believe and practice the headship veiling because it says it in the Bible. Second point I have, the head covering is beyond the visible. First of all, we are clearly giving a visible sign to those around us when wearing the head covering. It's an ordinance that gives a visual symbol for a spiritual truth, like communion service or baptism. It's also interesting to note that there are many believers throughout the world who still wear the head covering. In India, Romania, Russia, China, Haiti, there's a movement within America right now called the head covering movement. Mennonites have nothing to do with it, but a lot of women starting to wear the head covering as they study Scripture. This is also why the devil hates the head covering, because the head covering shows Satan and the angels your belief on the headship order. We shouldn't be surprised if our country is in turmoil if we work so hard to rebel against this principle. And I think it's one reason you find lukewarmness so much in many churches. Many theologians spend hours and hours on 1 Corinthians 11 trying to understand what it's about. And I don't claim to be able to give you a clear, perfect picture, and definitely just scratch the surface. The covering is not a salvation issue, but a great benefit and a blessing for us as a church to follow. The head covering had been worn since, I believe, creation. Jewish women in the Bible always had their head covered. In fact, the Orthodox Jews still do that today. A lot of them shave their head and wear wigs. That's what they call their head covering. In fact, if you were a Jewish man and your wife was caught in public not wearing a head covering, you were allowed to divorce her. There actually is much written in the early church about the headship covering, so much. Tertullian, Augustine, Jerome, Origen of Alexandria, and the list goes on. The evangelical forefathers like Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, John Knox, all wrote about the headship covering. Here's an interesting quote by John Calvin. So if women are thus permitted to have their heads uncovered and show their hair, they will come to make this an exhibition as if it were a tavern show. They will become so brazen that modesty and shame will be no more. In short, they will forget the duty of the nature. So when it is permissible for women to uncover their head, one will say, well, what harm is it in uncovering? And he goes on and on about that. That's John Calvin. The feminist movement of the 20s was the beginning of a downward spiral of morality in our country. One of the first things that changed in our churches in this movement was the head covering. But we all know Satan wasn't satisfied there. This led to immodesty, divorce, remarriage, women preachers. I think it's very clear for us here at Weavertown, if we expect not to follow the rebellion of the world, we need to humbly submit to, yes, the headship order, the head covering. And I know that's a hard one. People that are submissive, men or women, and follow Christ have a radiant spirit about them. I also believe there's a physical protection for women who wear the head covering. I believe when a woman wears a covering, she's pointing back to Christ's redemption. But after Christ came and died, men were asked to remove their covering because we can freely come before the Father and worship Him, now uncovered as men. Jesus took away our guilt and allowed us to come before the Father uncovered. You may be thinking, just like I was, why then should women come before the Father veiled? I struggled with this one. Did they not receive His righteousness? Absolutely they did. Of course we know women did receive the same righteousness that we received because of Christ. when you're wearing the covering, you are boldly saying, I am willing to humble myself and submit to my head the same way, and here's where the witness is, here's where the blessing is, that Jesus Christ did for his Father.
During the 19th century, many Christians in the United States and Western Europe began arguing that long hair constituted the only covering a woman needed. Others said that women only needed to wear a covering when in church. The middle class and wealthy women switched from veils and caps to ornate bonnets if they wore a covering at all. Bonnets became more a matter of fashion than modesty or obedience to 1 Corinthians 11. By the turn of the 20th century, the ornate bonnets of the 19th century had given way to hats or ladies' hats. Until the mid-century, women in Europe and America typically wore a hat or scarf in public, but were simply following tradition and fashion without realizing that there was originally a spiritual reason behind the practice. Similarly, until about 1960, Western women wore hats when in church, but the meaning behind the hat was lost. How many of y'all grew up when women wore hats in church? How many of y'all can remember your grandma was wearing hats or something, a little doily? How many of y'all remember doilies? The entire history of the church saw this scripture as not controversial at all, but very clear and very simple. It's us who don't see it like that. The widespread jettisoning of the practice of head covering can be traced to the mid-20th century, right around the time of the rise of modern feminism.
You don't have to just purposely be unattractive.
Are we simply dealing with a symbol, i.e. head coverings, that has lost its significance today, so another symbol like a wedding ring or even a wife's godly attitude toward her husband would fulfill the commands that we see? Head coverings, to be sure, is a second-tier doctrine. It doesn't rise to the importance of the triune nature of God or the deity of Christ or the gospel for that matter. But, friends, it is part of the canon of Scripture and is no less inspired. Literally, churches have split and much damage has been done right here in 1 Corinthians 11. And what is it over? Over a little bit of fabric on the head.
And the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head. For that is even all one, as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, forasmuch as he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. Judge in yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. You may be seated.